The letter had been sitting on Caleb Hartley's kitchen counter for 3 weeks before he finally read past the first line. We regret to inform you of the passing of Walter Hartley. He hadn't spoken to his grandfather in 6 years, not since the old man had stopped answering the phone in full sentences and started answering only in short, clipped bursts of words, the kind of speech Caleb had chalked up to age and stubbornness and a life spent mostly alone. Now, sitting in his cramped Asheville apartment with the letter finally unfolded all the way, he wondered if there had been another reason for that silence, something Walter had been protecting rather than simply forgetting how to say. Caleb had been good, once, at protecting things. It was the whole reason he'd become a fish and wildlife officer in the first place. A kid who'd grown up watching nature documentaries instead of cartoons, who'd majored in wildlife biology because he genuinely believed there was honest, meaningful work in standing between vulnerable creatures and the people who wanted to hurt them. For 6 years he'd believed it. He'd tracked poaching rings through 3 counties, testified in court against men who trafficked in bear gallbladders and ginseng roots stripped illegally from protected land, hauled injured animals out of leg-hold traps with his own hands. Then came the case that ended it. A poaching ring operating out of a hollow 2 counties over, men running black market trade in protected species, and a raid that had gone wrong in the particular, sickening way that raids go wrong when the people planning them underestimate how far desperate men will go to protect an illegal income. A colleague had been shot. Caleb had frozen, just for a second, just long enough that the memory of that second had followed him out of the field and into every night since. He'd filed his resignation 2 days after the man survived surgery, and he hadn't held a job since, coasting on savings and a slow, grinding sense that he'd failed at the one thing he'd ever wanted to be good at. So the lawyer's office in Boone felt, in a strange way, like a lifeline being thrown to a man who hadn't asked for one. 200 acres. A cabin. A red barn. Land his grandfather had kept, quietly and stubbornly, until the day he died. He kept mostly to himself up there, the lawyer said, sliding the folder across the desk. Hadn't seen him in town much these last few years. Neighbors said he still walked the property line every morning, rain or shine, right up until the end. Caleb signed where he was told to sign. He didn't mention his apartment lease was 3 days from expiring, or that he had nowhere else in particular to be. He told himself, driving the mountain roads 3 days later with everything he owned crammed into the bed of a 15-year-old Ford pickup, that this was simply the practical choice: free land, free housing, a chance to get his head right before deciding what came next. He did not expect, pulling up the gravel drive as the sun dropped low in gold behind the ridgeline, to feel something in his chest loosen for the first time in 8 months. The cabin was smaller than he remembered from childhood visits, log-built and solid, with a stone chimney and windows his grandfather had clearly reglazed himself sometime in the last decade. The red barn stood behind it, sway-backed but proud, its doors hanging slightly open like an old man's mouth caught mid-sentence. A split-rail fence, sagging in places, marked the edge of a north pasture gone to seed and wildflower. Everything smelled like wood smoke and pine and something else underneath that he couldn't name yet, something that would, in time, come to mean home in a way no apartment ever had. He told himself he'd stay a month. Get his head right. Figure out what came next. He did not expect, on his second morning, to walk out to the chicken coop, which he'd assumed was defunct, given his grandfather's age, but which some neighbor had apparently kept stocked out of habit or kindness, and find 6 brown eggs sitting neatly in the nesting boxes. Eggs that had not been there the evening before, when he'd checked and found the boxes bare and the coop door hanging half off its rusted hinge. He did not expect, on his 4th morning, to find the broken section of split-rail fence along the north pasture standing upright again overnight, the rails fitted back into their rotted post holes with a care and precision that no falling tree limb or wandering deer could have managed. He did not expect, on his 5th evening, to step into the woodshed and find the stacked firewood rearranged, not just added to, but rearranged, sorted by size the way his grandfather used to do it, a habit Caleb hadn't thought about in 15 years and certainly hadn't mentioned to anyone. And he did not expect, on his 6th evening, sitting on the porch with a beer he wasn't really drinking, watching the last light drain out of the sky, to hear the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps beneath the floor of the old barn, light, careful, deliberate, the sound of something that did not want to be heard and was nearly good enough at not being heard to succeed. Almost. Caleb told himself it was raccoons for exactly 4 days. He was a former wildlife officer. He knew what raccoons sounded like moving through a barn at night, the scrabble and chitter, the crash of something knocked loose and left where it fell. What he was hearing was not that. Raccoons didn't repair fences. Raccoons didn't sort firewood by size. Raccoons didn't, as he discovered on the 5th morning, leave garden tools cleaned and oiled and hung back exactly where they belonged on the pegboard, when he was fairly sure he'd left them out in the rain. He started watching the barn more closely after that. He noticed the way the hay bales along the back wall seemed subtly, deliberately arranged, not the careless stacking of a man in a hurry, which was how his grandfather had always stacked things, but a wall, precise and load-bearing, positioned to hide something behind it. On the 7th night, he couldn't stand not knowing any longer. He took a flashlight and did what 8 years of wildlife work told him he should have done from the beginning. He investigated properly, instead of standing on the porch making excuses. He moved past the old tractor his grandfather had never sold, past the wall of tools gone soft with dust and cobweb, and pulled the hay bales aside one at a time until his flashlight caught a gap in the floorboards behind them. A tunnel, hand-dug, its walls braced with old fence posts and scrap lumber, sloping down into a darkness that smelled, even from here, of moss and wood smoke and something warm and living. Every instinct from his old career told him to back away and call for backup. 8 years of training screamed that unknown dens meant unknown risk, that a cornered animal, any animal, was dangerous in ways a person standing at the entrance couldn't always predict. He crawled in anyway. 12 feet of packed earth later, the tunnel opened into a den that stopped him cold, not from fear, but from the strange, aching beauty of it. Blankets, hung from exposed roots, formed soft walls. A ring of stones held the ash of careful, smokeless fires. Jars of dried herbs and mushrooms lined a shelf someone had painstakingly carved into the dirt. A row of small hand-carved wooden foxes sat along a ledge like a child's toy collection kept long after childhood should have ended, each one slightly different, slightly more skilled than the last, as if their maker had grown up making them. And in the far corner, pressed as deep into the shadow as the den's walls allowed, was her. She was crouched low, one arm thrown protectively across her chest, the other braced hard against the earthen wall like she might claw her way straight through it and vanish. Bright orange fur, vivid even in flashlight, streaked now with dirt and dust, covered her from the crown of her head downward, and where a human woman's ears would have been, hers rose tall and triangular from a wild tangle of copper hair, flattened now so hard against her skull they nearly disappeared. A thick, full tail, its tip pale white, was wound so tightly around her own legs that it looked less like comfort than like armor, like the last barricade of something that had run out of other places to hide. She wore a patchwork of stitched-together fabric, a flannel shirt he recognized with a jolt as one of his grandfather's, a cut-down wool blanket, all of it sewn together with what looked, on closer inspection, like sinew and thread pulled from a dozen mismatched sources. Her eyes found his in the dark. They were huge, amber, and utterly, wordlessly terrified, the eyes of a creature that has learned, through hard experience, that stillness is sometimes the only thing standing between it and death. Caleb didn't move. Every part of his old training screamed at him to back out slow, to give a cornered animal an exit, to not become one more wall between it and safety. And some deeper part of him, some part that had nothing to do with training at all, understood in that same instant that this was not an animal. Not in any way that mattered. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said low and even, the same voice he used to talk down a spooked deer tangled in fence wire. She didn't answer. Her tail wound tighter still. He held both hands up, empty, and took a slow step backward toward the tunnel mouth. Making himself smaller, less of a wall between her and the only way out. It was only then, when he'd given ground instead of taking it, that she spoke, barely above a whisper, her voice rough with what he'd later understand was years of near-total disuse. "Please, don't tell anyone I'm here." He didn't tell anyone. There was, if he was honest, no one left to tell. No coworkers he was still speaking to, no family beyond a mother 2 states away he called twice a year out of obligation more than closeness. But even if there had been, he understood by the time he'd crawled back out of that tunnel that telling was never going to be an option. Not after those eyes. Not after that whisper. He backed out of the den that first night without another word, resealed the barn as best he could, and didn't sleep. He lay awake running through everything he knew about frightened, isolated creatures, every technique he'd ever used coaxing an injured animal into a trap it could survive, and understood, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that none of it quite applied. Whoever, was living beneath his barn wasn't wildlife. She was a person who had been forced, by something Caleb didn't yet understand, to live like one. In the morning, he did the only thing that felt right. He carried a plate down to the mouth of the tunnel, eggs since apparently those were already a kind of quiet currency between them, along with bread and a jar of his grandfather's honey he'd found in the pantry, and set it on a flat stone just inside the entrance. Then he walked away without looking back, the way you were supposed to with anything wild enough to bolt at the wrong kind of attention. The plate was empty by evening. He repeated it the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He didn't try to go back down into the den. Some instinct, sharper than any training, told him that pushing forward now would unravel whatever fragile thread had let her speak to him at all. Instead he left food, and small things beyond it. A folded wool blanket without mouth holes, a bar of soap, a hairbrush he felt strange buying at the general store in town and stranger still leaving on a stone at the mouth of a hole in his own barn floor. 2 weeks in, he found a note. It was written on the back of a torn seed packet, in handwriting careful and slightly uneven, like someone relearning a skill they hadn't practiced in years. "Thank you?" Nothing else. Just those 2 words, and beneath them, small and hesitant, a single drawn fox print, like a signature she wasn't sure she had the right to give yet. He wrote back on the same packet. "You're welcome. My name is Caleb. I won't come down unless you want me to." The next morning, a new scrap of paper waited on the stone mirror. It was the first exchange in a correspondence that stretched across the following month, notes traded on torn envelopes and the backs of seed packets, and eventually, actual paper Caleb started leaving beside a stub of pencil. Sometimes the notes were a single word. Sometimes, as the weeks wore on and something in her seemed to loosen by degrees, they were whole sentences. She asked once if the blue car that came up the drive on Thursdays was dangerous. It was only the mail carrier, he explained, and the next note back seemed, if a note could convey such a thing, faintly relieved. He asked carefully if she was hurt, if she needed a doctor, if there was anything at all he could do. She wrote back that she was fine, that she'd been fine a long time, that fine was mostly just a word she'd learned to live inside of whether or not it was true. He didn't push past what she offered. He'd spent a career learning that trust was something wild wasn't built by reaching for it. It was built by being predictable. By being safe. By being there, in the same quiet way, morning after morning, evening after evening, until the distance closed on its own instead of being forced. It was 6 weeks before she came up out of the tunnel in daylight for the first time. Standing at the shadowed edge of the barn, while he split firewood 40 feet away, close enough that he understood it was a message, and far enough that he understood not to close the gap himself. He kept splitting wood, made himself busy and unthreatening, and didn't look at her directly more than twice. When he glanced up the 3rd time, she was gone. But the next morning's note said, "I watched you for an hour. You didn't try to catch me. Thank you." It was 8 weeks before she came all the way out and spoke to him again, standing at a cautious distance in the yard, sunlight catching copper and golden fur that had, he noticed, started to lose some of the dirt and dishevelment of that first night. "You didn't tell anyone," she said. It wasn't quite a question. I said I wouldn't. People say things. Her tail flicked, tense, not yet trusting. It doesn't mean they mean them. I mean it, Caleb said. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything about. He gestured, a little helplessly, at all of it, at her, at the tunnel, at the 8 weeks of careful notes. But I understand what it looks like when someone's been hurt bad enough that they'd rather live in a hole in the ground than risk trusting anyone with the truth. I'm not going to be one more person who makes that worse. Not on purpose, and not if I can help it by accident either. Something in her face, carefully, minutely, softened, the way ice softens at the very edges before anyone can call it melting. It was the first time he'd seen anything cross her expression that wasn't fear or wariness. Okay, she said. Just that. But it was, he would understand much later, the exact moment everything between them actually began. Her full name, he learned eventually, was Mira Orendel, and over the slow unspooling of the following months, through conversations held first at careful distances in the yard and eventually, as autumn crept in and the first hard frost silvered the grass, over shared meals at his kitchen table with the door propped deliberately open so she never felt closed in, Caleb learned what she was. Not an alien. Not a myth, whatever old mountain folklore occasionally whispered about foxfolk in the deep hollows. Vulpines, she explained one evening, wrapped in a blanket by his fire, had shared the forests of the world with humankind for longer than either species had written history to prove it, an old, quiet, deeply private people who had turned survival into something like an art form, specifically because humanity's history with anything different from itself had rarely been kind. We're not hidden because we're ashamed, she told him, her voice steadier than it had been weeks before. We're hidden because it's the only thing that's ever kept us alive, she told him, in pieces that emerged over many evenings rather than all at once, about the settlement she'd grown up in, a hollow deep in these same mountains, tucked behind a waterfall that Vulpine hands had shaped over generations to look, from any human angle, entirely impassable. A warren of dens not so different from the one beneath his barn, except full of family, she said, and her voice did something complicated on the word. Full of laughter. Full of people who knew her name before she could speak it herself. She told him, more slowly still, about the night it ended. She'd been 17, young, by Vulpine reckoning, still more cub than adult, when a private survey team, contracted by a mining conglomerate scouting mineral rights deep in the mountains, had stumbled onto the edge of her hollow's territory. What happened next, she'd come to understand only in the years since, was not an accident of discovery. It was a decision, made by people with money and no particular conscience, that a hidden population of non-human beings sitting on land they wanted was a problem to be solved rather than a people to be respected. They called it containment, she said, staring into the fire, her hands very still in her lap. That's the word I heard, before everyone scattered. Not capture. Not even hunt. Containment. Like we were a chemical spill instead of a family. The settlement had scattered in every direction at once, families torn apart in the chaos of the dark and the running, cubs separated from parents by things Mira still would not fully describe even now. She had run alone for 3 days before some old, half-remembered instinct, her grandmother's stories about a den that reminded her of home, a place an old human farmer had once, decades before, quietly discovered and chosen not to disturb, led her, exhausted and half-starved, to Walter Hartley's land. Your grandfather knew, she said. Not everything. But he knew something lived under the barn, and he never once made me feel like I had to explain myself or leave. He left food sometimes, early on, before I trusted myself to take it. He mended the fence line in a way that made it harder for strangers to wander up here without him noticing. He never came looking past what I let him find. She looked at Caleb, firelight gold in her eyes. I think he understood, somehow, what it means to need a place no one else is looking for you. Caleb thought of Walter's strange, clipped phone calls in his last years, sentences that sounded, now, like a man carefully protecting something he never explained. Grief tangled unexpectedly, with something that felt almost like gratitude. He never told me any of this, Caleb said. He never told anyone. That was the entire point of it. Mira looked at him steadily. You're the first person I've told everything to. In 4 years. Why me? She was quiet a long moment, tail curling, uncurling, curling again in her lap. Because you didn't try to fix me the first night. You didn't call anyone, or trap me, or ask me to explain myself before you'd even bring me food. A small, unpracticed smile touched her mouth. You just waited. Nobody's waited for me in a very long time. There was more to the Vulpine world than grief, though it took her longer to trust him with the lighter parts of it, as if joy, having been taken from her once so completely, was somehow more precious to protect than sorrow. She taught him, in pieces, the small rituals of her people. The way a Vulpine child's first successful hunt was marked not with praise but with a shared silence, a moment of respect for the life taken to sustain another. The way names were chosen not at birth but at 7, once a cub had shown the family enough of who they were becoming to be given a name that actually fit. The way storytelling in the hollow wasn't performed by a single voice but built collectively, each person in the circle adding a line, so that no story ever belonged to just one teller. Tell me one, Caleb said one evening. A story from the hollow. However much of it you remember. Mira considered this with the same careful seriousness she brought to everything now. There's one about the first Vulpine and the first human, she said finally. My grandmother told it best, but I'll try. She settled deeper into her chair, tail curling around her feet. Long before either of our peoples kept written histories, a Vulpine hunter and a human trapper found themselves caught in the same flood, clinging to the same fallen tree, carried miles downriver together before the water finally released them onto the same muddy bank. Neither had any reason to trust the other. Every story either of them had been told said the other kind was dangerous. But they were both cold, and both far from home, and there was only one dry cave nearby big enough for two. What happened? They shared the cave. Shared a fire. Didn't kill each other in their sleep, which apparently surprised them both. A faint smile. In the morning, they went their separate ways, and neither one ever spoke of it to their own kind, because they knew no one would believe that the other side could be anything other than an enemy. But the story says that every generation since, in some quiet corner of the world, a Vulpine and a human find themselves stranded together on the same muddy bank, and have to decide all over again whether the old fears are still true. She looked at him, firelight warm on her face. My grandmother used to say it was the oldest story we had, and also somehow always brand new. Sounds familiar, Caleb said quietly, and Mira laughed, soft, surprised, delighted, and reached across the space between their chairs to take his hand, as if to prove the old story right one more time. Winter came hard to the mountain that year, and with it came a change neither of them announced out loud but both understood was happening by degrees. Mira stopped returning to the den beneath the barn except to sleep, at first, and then not even that. Caleb spent 2 weeks teaching himself carpentry out of library books in sheer stubbornness, and built her a small room off the back of the cabin with her own window facing the tree line, her own door she could shut or leave open exactly as she chose. She filled it slowly with the carved fox figures from her old den, with pressed autumn leaves, with the particular chaos of someone allowing herself, for the first time in years, to accumulate things instead of always staying ready to run. They fell into rhythms that felt, to both of them, dangerously close to ordinary happiness. She taught him to read the forest the way Vulpines did, a deeper grammar of broken twigs and disturbed leaf litter that went beyond even his old wildlife training, a whole language of the woods that had never been meant for human eyes and that she offered him anyway, patiently, over long walks that stretched later and later into each afternoon. He taught her, in turn, the small mechanics of the modern human world she'd been isolated from for 4 years, how a radio worked, what a grocery store was, the genuinely bewildering fact that humans paid money for water in plastic bottles when a mountain spring ran clean and free not 200 yards from his porch. She laughed at that one for a full 5 minutes, doubled over at the kitchen table, tail thumping against the floor. It was, Caleb thought, watching her, the best sound he'd heard in years. Better than anything he remembered from before the raid that ended his career. Better than anything from a life that had, until 6 weeks ago, felt like it was mostly over. Their evenings became a ritual either of them named but both protected fiercely. Dinner at the table, her tail curling contentedly around the chair leg rather than defensively around herself. Long conversations that stretched past midnight about nothing and everything. Her childhood memories of the hollow behind the waterfall. His own strange, solitary upbringing by a mother who'd worked 3 jobs and a father who'd left before he could form a single memory of him, the particular, matching ache of 2 people who had each spent years learning how to be alone and were only now, slowly, discovering how unnecessary that lesson had turned out to be. There was a night in late November when an early ice storm knocked the power out across the whole ridge, and Caleb came in from checking the generator to find Mira crouched by the dark hearth. Hands shaking, not from cold but from something older. The sudden dark and the crack of ice-laden branches outside sounding, he realized with a jolt, uncomfortably close to another night 4 years gone, another kind of chaos in the dark. He didn't reach for her. He sat down on the floor an arm's length away, in the dark, and talked quietly about nothing important, the first case he'd ever worked as an officer, a raccoon that had gotten itself spectacularly stuck in a mailbox. Until her shaking eased and she scooted, on her own, the distance between them, and let her head rest against his shoulder. "I hate that sound," she admitted, once the fire was finally lit and the room had gone warm and gold again. "Ice on branches. It sounds like—" She stopped. "You don't have to finish that," Caleb said. "I know." She was quiet a moment. "I want to, though. Someday. Just not tonight." "Okay," he said, and meant it, and she leaned a little more of her weight into him, and neither of them moved again until the fire burned down to embers. The first time he took her hand was small and almost accidental, steadying her over a fallen log on one of their long ridge walks, his hand finding hers, and neither of them quite letting go once the log was cleared. She looked down at their joined hands like she was reading something written in a language she was only just learning to understand, and then she looked up at him, and something passed between them that didn't require a single word. "I used to think," she said much later on the porch, "that the safest thing in the world was to need nothing. No one. Nothing that could be taken from me twice. And now I think I'd forgotten how good it feels to need someone." Her fingers tightened around his. "I don't want to forget that again." He kissed her for the first time that night, snow just beginning to fall through the bare branches of the oak his grandfather had planted decades before either of them existed, and it felt, to both of them, less like a beginning than like something that had already been quietly, patiently true for weeks, and was only now, finally, being said out loud. They spent the deep winter months learning each other in the unglamorous, essential ways that mattered more than any single kiss on a snowy porch, whose turn it was to bank the fire before bed, how Mira took her coffee once she decided she liked it, with too much honey, which Caleb teased her about mercilessly. The particular quiet Caleb needed some mornings when the old memory of the raid crept back into him uninvited, and which Mira learned to simply sit beside without demanding an explanation, the same grace he'd once given her. She told him, one snowbound evening, about her father, a name she'd avoided until then, Bram Orendel, a builder in the hollow known for shaping the very passage behind the waterfall that let the settlement come and go unseen. He'd been near the rear of the group the night everyone scattered, helping elders and cubs toward the deep trails, and Mira had lost sight of him in the chaos and never learned, in 4 years, whether he'd survived. "I used to think not knowing was worse than knowing something terrible," she said. "Now I'm not sure. At least not knowing lets me keep hoping." Caleb didn't offer false comfort. He'd learned, across the winter, that Mira didn't want to be managed out of her grief, only accompanied through it. "When we're ready," he said, "I'll help you find out. Whatever the answer is." She studied him for a long moment, firelight catching in eyes gone soft. "You keep saying things like that. Like helping me isn't a burden." "It isn't," he said simply. It's just what you do for someone you. He stopped himself, suddenly aware of the word waiting at the end of that sentence, and how large it was, and how new. Myra's ears flicked toward him, alert, hopeful. Someone you what? He looked at her, dirt long since washed from fur that had grown glossy and full over months of proper food and rest, a tail that curled easily around her now instead of clenching like armor, amber eyes that no longer flinched first and asked questions second. And he understood there was no version of finishing that sentence that wasn't true. Someone I love, he said. The room went very still. Then Mira crossed the space between them, quick as anything wild, and kissed him, and this time there was nothing careful or tentative in it at all. I love you too, she murmured against his mouth. I think I have since the fence. The fence? You never once asked me to explain the fence. You just left honey out the next morning. She laughed, wet-eyed and bright. I decided that day you were worth trusting. It just took me a while to admit it. If anyone had asked Caleb, in the months that followed, to name the single happiest stretch of his life, he would not have described the day Mira told him she loved him, or the day at the waterfall, or even the porch proposal a year later. He would have described, instead, an unremarkable Tuesday in April. Mud season on the mountain, the ground still soft and dark from snow melt, when nothing at all happened, and that was the entire point. He woke before dawn, as he'd started to again, some old habit from his officer days reasserting itself now that it had something worth waking up for. Mira was already gone from the bed, which didn't worry him the way it once might have. He found her, as he usually did those mornings, out at the coop, murmuring to the hens in a low, private register that wasn't quite English, gathering eggs with a gentleness no human farmhand would have thought necessary, and that the hens, Caleb was fairly sure, appreciated anyway. You're up early, he said, leaning in the doorway. You always say that like it's not also true of you. She didn't look up from the nesting box, but her tail flicked once, a small, easy greeting. There's a fox den 2 ridges over. New litter. I want to go check on them before the day gets warm. Mind company? She smiled at that, a real smile, unguarded, the kind that had taken the better part of a year to become ordinary instead of rare. I never mind your company. They spent the morning on the ridge, Mira teaching him to move quietly enough that the vixen 2 ridges over never so much as lifted her head at their approach, for kits tumbling over each other in a patch of sun outside the den entrance. Caleb, who had spent 8 years of his professional life studying wild canids from a clinical, careful distance, found something entirely different in watching them beside Mira. Not data, not a case file, just 4 small lives being allowed, for one golden morning, to exist without anyone needing anything from them. They remind me of my hollow, Mira said quietly, watching the kits wrestle. Before. When I was small enough that the worst thing in my world was falling asleep before the story ended. Do you miss it? Being that small, that unaware? She considered the question with the seriousness she gave most things now, a habit Caleb had come to treasure. Mira had never learned, in her years alone, how to answer carelessly, and hadn't unlearned that carefulness even now that it was safe to. Sometimes. But I don't think I'd trade what I have now to get it back. I like who I've become. Even the hard parts of becoming her. She glanced sideways at him. You had something to do with that. I think you did most of it yourself. Maybe. Her tail brushed against his hand, deliberate. But I did it easier because you were here. They walked home slower than they needed to, taking the long way past the creek, and Caleb thought, watching sunlight move through the new spring leaves and catch gold in Myra's fur, that he had spent 8 years of his old career believing meaningful work meant standing between danger and something vulnerable and some dramatic, decisive moment. He understood now that it also meant this. The unremarkable, accumulating grace of 10,000 ordinary mornings, each one a small, quiet vote that the world could still be a place worth staying in. That evening, over dinner, Mira set down her fork and looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize as the one she wore right before saying something that had taken her days to work up the courage to say. I want to ask you something, she said. And I need you to answer honestly, not kindly. Okay. Do you regret it? Leaving your old life. The career you wanted since you were a kid for. She gestured at the cabin, at herself, at all of it. This. Me. Caleb set his own fork down and thought about it properly, the way the question deserved. I spent 8 months before you feeling like I'd failed at the only thing that ever mattered to me, he said finally. And I thought this land, this cabin, was just a place to hide from that failure until I figured out what came next. He reached across the table for her hand. It turned out the thing that came next was better than anything I was chasing before. I don't regret one single day of it, Mira. Not one. She didn't say anything for a moment, just held his hand tight enough that he understood the question had mattered more than she'd let on. Then, good. Because I was worried I was something you'd settled for instead of something you chose. You were never a consolation prize, Caleb said. You were the whole reason any of the rest of it started making sense again. Spring came, and with it came the strangers. Caleb heard the truck before he saw it, an unmarked white pickup grinding up the gravel drive, 2 figures inside dressed in the kind of khaki and fleece uniform designed to read as harmless outdoor professionalism. He was in the yard, and by pure old instinct, he was already angling his body toward the barn, toward Mira, who he knew was inside tending the chicken coop, before the truck had even rolled to a stop. Afternoon, the driver said, climbing out with a clipboard and a smile that never once reached his eyes. Sorry to intrude, we're with a wildlife research group, contracted through the state. We're tracking a large predator that's been spotted in this area over the last few weeks. Wanted to give landowners a heads up, ask if you'd seen anything unusual. Caleb's old career had trained him to read people the way Mira read forests, and everything about this man read wrong. The clipboard held forms with no state seal on them. The uniform was too clean, too new, the fleece still holding factory creases. And when the second man climbed out of the passenger side, Caleb caught, for half a second, the unmistakable outline of a tranquilizer rifle case in the truck bed, half covered by a tarp arranged in a hurry that hadn't quite finished the job. Can't say I have, Caleb said, keeping his voice easy, keeping his body angled between the men and the barn's open door. Big property, though. Lot of ground to miss things on. Mind if we take a look around? Won't take long. Actually, I do mind, Caleb said, and let just enough of his old officer's authority slide into his voice to make clear this wasn't a negotiation. This is private land, gentlemen. If you're state contractors, I'd like to see actual state paperwork, not a clipboard. And I'd like you off my property inside the next 5 minutes. The driver's smile thinned into something colder. Of course. We'll be in touch with the proper documentation. His eyes flicked once toward the barn, a half-second glance that told Caleb everything he needed to know. Have a good day, Mr. Hartley. They knew his name. He hadn't given it. He watched the truck grind back down the drive and out of sight before he let himself move, fast, toward the barn. Mira was already at the tunnel mouth when he got there, tense, ears flat against her skull, tail bristled to twice its normal size. You heard them? He asked. I heard everything, she said, and her voice shook, not with the old fear he remembered from that first terrified night, but with something colder, older, and far angrier. Caleb. I know that voice. Not that specific man. That kind of voice. That's the voice they used the night the hollows scattered. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He spent it instead at his grandfather's old desk, pulling out contacts he hadn't touched in years. A former colleague at Fish and Wildlife who still owed him a favor from a poaching case they'd closed together, a county records clerk he'd once helped out of a jam, a journalist who'd covered illegal mining operations in these mountains a decade back and had never quite let the story go fully cold. By morning he had a name. Aldermont Resource Solutions, a private contractor with a 2-decade history of so-called predator relocation, work for mining and land development interests across 6 states. And a quiet, persistent pattern of complaints buried in obscure county records, from landowners who'd reported strange men on their property asking pointed questions about large canid activity in areas that, Caleb now understood with a sick, settling certainty, correlated almost exactly with historical local folklore about fox folk and forest people. Dismissed for generations as superstition by everyone except, apparently, the people getting quietly paid to hunt them down. "They'd been doing this a long time," Caleb said, spreading the printouts across the kitchen table. "Longer than just your hollow. This isn't one incident. This is a program." Myra's hands were steady on the papers, but her voice wasn't. "Why? What do they even want with us?" "Lan," Caleb said grimly. "Every one of these incidents happened right before a resource extraction permit got approved nearby. You said your hollow sat near a proposed mining site. I'd bet good money there's contested mineral rights on this mountain too. A hidden population that legally doesn't exist, that can't file a complaint or own land or testify in court, is a very convenient thing for a company like this to make disappear." Mira was quiet a long moment, staring at the papers, at the pattern of a decades-long, deliberate cruelty laid bare in cold bureaucratic language. Then she looked up, and there was something new in her eyes. Not the fear of that first night in the den, but something harder, steadier, forged. "I'm done running," she said. "I ran once. I lost everyone I loved doing it. I am not losing this too." Her hand found his across the table. "But I don't know how to fight in your world. Their paperwork, their trucks there." "I do," Caleb said quietly. "I spent 8 years learning exactly how people like this operate, and exactly how to stop them, before I let myself forget it was worth doing." He squeezed her hand. "Not anymore." They spent the following week preparing in earnest. Caleb called in every favor he had left. Danny Rees, the fish and wildlife colleague, agreed to drive up personally rather than simply advising from a distance. The journalist, a sharp, tireless woman named Priya Chandrasekharan who never fully let go of the mining corruption story she chased a decade earlier, drove up too, notebook already half full of Aldermont's public filings. Mira, for her part, spent the week walking the property with an intensity Caleb hadn't seen from her before, memorizing every game trail and forgotten logging road with a precision that made it clear this had once been a survival skill, not a hobby. "If they come back with more men," she said one evening, tracing old trail lines onto a hand-drawn map by lamplight, "I want to know exactly where every path leads before they do." There was a night, midweek, when the strain of it caught up with her all at once. Caleb found her sitting on the floor of her old room, the room he'd built her, surrounded by the carved fox figures she'd brought up from the tunnel, not crying exactly but very quiet in a way that worried him more than tears would have. "I keep thinking about the sound," she said, when he sat down beside her. "The night the hollow scattered. Trucks in the dark. Men shouting orders like we were something to be herded." Her hands still, folded around one of the small wooden foxes. "I swore I'd never let myself be that afraid again. And here it is, coming right up my own driveway." "You're not 17 anymore," Caleb said. "You're not alone in the dark this time." "I know that." "I do." She looked at him, eyes bright. "But knowing it and feeling it aren't always the same thing." "No," he agreed. "They're not. But I'm not going anywhere, Mira. Whatever happens next, you won't be facing it from underneath a barn floor with no one even knowing you're there. You'll be facing it standing next to me, in the open, with people who know exactly who you are and aren't going anywhere either." He took her hand, closed his own around it, and the small wooden fox both. "That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," she said quietly, and leaned into him, and for a long while neither of them said anything else at all. Just sat together in the lamplight, bracing for whatever the coming week would bring, and finding, in each other, that it was possible to be afraid and steady at the very same time. They came back within the week, not with clipboards this time, but with 3 trucks, real tranquilizer equipment no longer hidden under tarps, and a confidence that told Caleb they believed no one on this mountain would seriously stand in their way. He was ready for them. Danny stood beside him on the porch in an actual state uniform, Priya a few steps back with a notepad and a camera already recording, and behind the barn, out of sight but close enough to move fast if needed, Mira waited with a knowledge of the terrain that no map Aldermont's men carried could match. "Aldermont Resource Solutions," Danny said, stepping forward with a clipboard of his own, a real one, state-issued. "We've had several formal complaints about unauthorized wildlife operations on private land in this county. I'll need to see your actual state contract, gentlemen, or I'll be citing you for trespass and unauthorized use of tranquilizer equipment, which is a felony charge when unlicensed." The driver's easy smile finally, fully cracked. His eyes swept the property once more, toward the barn, toward the tree line, toward whatever he still believed might be hiding there. And Caleb stepped, deliberately, into that sight line, blocking it. "There's nothing here for you," Caleb said, low and even. "There never was. And if you or anyone from your company sets foot on this land again, the next call isn't to a state agent. It's to every news outlet in 3 states, with a decade of your company's paper trail attached." He nodded toward Priya. "She's already got the first draft written." For a long, taut moment, nobody moved. Somewhere behind the barn, Caleb knew, Mira was watching, ready to run the old trails at a heartbeat's notice if this went wrong. It didn't. The driver's jaw tightened, and he turned back toward the trucks without another word, the other men following, and the convoy ground back down the gravel drive and out of sight. It wasn't over. Caleb knew men like that rarely stopped after a single setback. They regrouped, found new angles, waited for a moment of weakness. That moment came 2 weeks later, in the dead of night, when Caleb woke to the sound of a vehicle idling far too close to the barn, engine running without headlights. He was out the door in seconds, and found 2 of Aldermont's men at the tunnel entrance itself, having somehow located the exact spot, tranquilizer rifles raised toward the dark opening in the floorboards. "Get away from there," Caleb said, and the fury in his own voice surprised him. The nearer man turned the rifle toward him instead, and for one long, terrible second Caleb understood exactly what it felt like to stand on the wrong end of the very violence he'd once been trained to prevent. The same violence that had ended his career, the second of frozen fear he'd carried for 8 months like a stone in his chest. He didn't freeze this time. He moved fast and low, the way Mira had taught him to move through the dark understory of the ridge, and knocked the rifle wide just as it fired, the tranquilizer dart burying itself harmlessly in a hay bale instead of flesh. The second man lunged, and Caleb went down hard into the dirt, grappling, until the barn door slammed open and Mira was there. Not hiding, not frozen, but moving with a speed and ferocity Caleb had never seen from her, driving the second man back with nothing but her own considerable strength and 4 years of learning exactly how to survive. By the time Danny arrived, alerted by Caleb's frantic call, both intruders were pinned, disarmed, and thoroughly regretting their choices. The tranquilizer rifles, the unmarked truck, the trespass in the dead of night on private land. It was, finally, enough evidence to end Aldermont Resource Solutions' quiet operations for good. Priya's story broke 3 weeks later, a sprawling investigation into the company's decades-long pattern of quasi-legal, predator relocation, work tied to mining interests, built on complaints and evidence from a dozen counties across 3 states. The company's state contracts were suspended within a month, its executives facing charges that would take years to resolve but that ended, decisively, any further operations on this mountain. It was not, Caleb knew, a permanent victory. Men like that rarely stayed gone for good. But it was enough. Enough for Mira to stop flinching at the sound of an engine on the drive. Enough for the mountain to feel, again, like a place that could hold both of them safely. Summer settled over the farm the way it always had, thick and green and humming with insects, and the 2 of them settled into it like something that had always belonged there. Mira no longer slept in the room off the back of the cabin out of caution alone. She slept there, more often than not, curled against Caleb's side in his own room, because it was simply where she wanted to be. The tunnel beneath the barn stood empty now, its blanket walls taken down, its carved fox figures moved into the cabin's front room where morning light caught them and scattered small warm shadows across the floor. She still visited the tunnel sometimes, not out of need, but the way a person visits a childhood home long after they've moved away, with a complicated tenderness Caleb had learned not to interrupt. It was on one of those visits, in late July, that she found something new. Fresh scratch marks worked into the old fence post near the tree line, arranged in a pattern she recognized immediately, one that made her go very still. "That's a marker," she told Caleb that evening, voice tight with something between fear and a hope she seemed almost afraid to let herself feel. "A Vulpine marker. Someone left that. Recently. Days ago, maybe less." They followed the trail the next morning. A series of subtle signs only Myra's eyes could fully read, worked into bark and stone, leading up through higher ridgelines behind the farm, deeper into mountains Caleb had hiked 100 times over the years without ever suspecting what they hid. 3 hours in, past a waterfall that from any ordinary angle looked like nothing more than water running over rock, Myra stopped dead in the trail. "I know this place," she whispered, barely audible over the falling water. "I know this waterfall." She stepped forward, hand trembling, and pressed her palm flat against a particular stone at the waterfall's edge, and the water, or the rock, or some old mechanism built patiently into both over generations, shifted, and a passage opened behind the falling curtain, and beyond it, impossibly, was a hollow full of den fires and carved wooden homes and dozens of vulpines who turned, as one, at the sound of footsteps on stone. An older woman near the front of the gathering went very still, ears rising, eyes widening, and then she was moving, fast, faster than Caleb had ever seen anyone move, pulling Myra into her arms and sobbing into her fur, and Myra was sobbing too, saying a single word, "Mother," that Caleb understood he was witnessing something he had no right to fully comprehend, only to stand quietly beside. They stayed 3 days in the hollow. Myra's mother, Isolde, told the story of the scattering from her own side of it, the desperate flight through the dark, the years spent rebuilding in secret with the handful of survivors she'd managed to gather, the search, quiet and constant and never once abandoned, for the daughter she'd lost track of in the chaos and never stopped looking for, season after season, for 4 long years. Myra told her own story in turn, of the barn, of the years alone, of Walter Hartley's quiet, unasked-for kindness, of Caleb. Caleb sat through most of it at a respectful distance, offered a place by the fire that he understood was itself a significant gesture, an outsider, a human, welcomed into a hidden hollow that had survived for centuries specifically by never doing exactly that. He caught Isolde watching him more than once, appraising, careful, and understood that whatever came next between them all would depend at least partly on what she decided she saw in him. There was, too, harder news amid the joyful reunion. Myra asked, gently, haltingly, about her father, and watched her mother's face for the answer before the words came. Bram Orendel had survived the scattering, Isolde told her. Had, in fact, helped lead a second group of survivors to a smaller den 2 ridgelines over, and had spent 4 years, same as Isolde, searching every season for the daughter he'd lost sight of in the dark. He was traveling now, Isolde said, checking on that second den, but he would return within days, and Myra wept again, differently this time, with a grief that had finally, after 4 years, found room to become relief instead. On the 3rd evening, Isolde came and sat beside Caleb at the fire's edge, while Myra was across the hollow reconnecting with cousins she'd thought lost for good. "She told me what you did," Isolde said. "The men who came for her. The company. What you risked to stop them." "I didn't do it alone," Caleb said. "And I didn't do enough. Not for what happened to your people years ago. Nothing I did undoes that. No one thing could have," Isolde said, not unkindly. "But you did something, when it mattered most, for the one part of my family I still had left to protect. That is not a small thing, human." She studied him a long moment, firelight caught in amber eyes so like her daughter's. "You could have handed her over. Reported her to the authorities. Sold the story to a newspaper for money you clearly could have used. Many humans would have done exactly that. Some out of fear. Some out of simple greed. You did neither, not once, in an entire year. She's not something to hand over," Caleb said simply. She's Mira. Isolde's expression softened into something that was, unmistakably, the beginning of approval. My daughter chose well, she said. I only wish it hadn't taken 4 years apart to lead her to you. So do I, Caleb said quietly. But I don't regret a single day of the year that followed. The offer came on the last morning, gently, without pressure. The hollow had room, Isolde said, for Mira to stay, to rebuild the family and the childhood the scattering had stolen from her, to finally, after 4 hard years, come fully home. Mira stood at the mouth of the passage behind the waterfall, looking back into the hollow that held her mother, her father soon to return, cousins she'd thought lost forever. Looking back at the childhood she had lost and the family finally, miraculously, restored to her. Then she looked at Caleb, standing quietly a few feet away, giving her the space to choose without a single word of pressure, exactly the way he had given her space from the very first night in the den beneath the barn. She crossed the distance between them and took his hand. I love you, she told her mother, a voice thick. And I am never going to disappear from your life again. I will come back every season, I promise you that, for the rest of both our lives. Her fingers tightened around Caleb's. But I already have a home. I found it under an old barn, when I thought I had nothing left, and then I found out it was never really the barn at all. It was always going to be wherever he was. She smiled, the same soft, unguarded smile she'd given Caleb for the first time months ago, over a shared dinner at his kitchen table with snow falling outside, and said the words that would echo in both their memories for the rest of their lives. I already found my home. Isolde did not argue. She embraced her daughter once more, long and fierce, and then embraced Caleb too, briefly, fiercely, in a gesture he understood was not given lightly. The passage is always open to you both, she said. Every season. No exceptions. The farm looked different now, though nothing about it had structurally changed. The fence lines were solid, mended properly with new wood instead of temporary patches. The chicken coop had been fully rebuilt, its hinges sound. The barn's old roof had finally been repaired, this time by both of them together, in broad daylight, with no need for secrecy at all. The tunnel beneath the barn was still there, its entrance no longer hidden behind stacked hay bales but marked instead with a small carved fox, set into the earth like a quiet monument to what the space had once meant, and what it no longer needed to be. Mira visited the hollow behind the waterfall every season, exactly as she'd promised, and every season Caleb walked with her at least part of the way, learning, slowly and patiently, the deeper language of the forest that had once been entirely closed to him. Bram had returned within the week, as Isolde promised, and the reunion between father and daughter had been, by Myra's own quiet account afterward, the single best day of her life until the day Caleb asked her to marry him. Which happened, fittingly, at the mouth of the old tunnel, on the 1-year anniversary of the night he first crawled through it, and found a terrified girl pressed into the dark. She'd said yes before he even finished the question. On a warm evening in early autumn, Caleb sat on the porch with Mira curled against his side, her tail wrapped loosely and contentedly around them both, and watched the sun go down gold over land that had once felt, to both of them, like the last place either expected to find anything worth staying for. Do you ever think about it? He asked. What would have happened if I'd never gone looking that night? Mira was quiet a moment, watching the light fade over the tree line. I think, she said finally, I would still be down there. Still hiding. Still telling myself that safety and loneliness were the same thing, because it was easier to believe that than to hope for anything better. She turned, pressing a soft kiss to his jaw. I'm glad you came looking. I'm glad you let me find you. They were married the following spring, in the hollow behind the waterfall, in a ceremony that blended traditions from both of their worlds in ways neither had quite anticipated but both found, in the end, exactly right. Isolde and Bram stood together at the front of the gathered hollow, Bram's hand resting proud and steady on his daughter's shoulder as he walked her the last few steps of the passage behind the falls. Danny Rees came, and Priya, and the handful of remaining friends Caleb had kept through his years away from his old career, all of them ducking, wide-eyed and reverent, through a waterfall into a hidden world they'd never fully believe existed even standing inside it. Priya cried through the entire ceremony and blamed it, unconvincingly, on the mist off the falls. Mara wore a dress stitched by her mother's hands from fabric found in 3 different corners of the mountain. Human cloth traded honestly now, at last, instead of scavenged from abandoned cabins in desperate silence, and carried, tucked into her sleeve where only Caleb would notice it, the very first carved fox she'd ever made in the den beneath the barn, small and rough and precious. "For luck," she told him, when he asked about it later. "And so some part of that girl in the tunnel gets to be here too. She earned it." They built their life, in the years that followed, in the space between 2 worlds rather than fully inside either one, the farm remaining exactly what it had always been, solid and green and quietly theirs, while the passage behind the waterfall stayed open in both directions, no longer a boundary but a bridge. Caleb went back to wildlife work eventually, in a fashion he never could have predicted. Consulting, quietly and unofficially, for state agencies investigating land use fraud, using everything he'd learned taking down Aldermont to make sure no other hidden community, Vulpine or otherwise, ever had to live in fear beneath someone's barn floor again. Mara became something like a bridge herself, the first Vulpine in a generation to move openly, carefully, trustingly between her people's world and the human one, teaching Isolde's Hollow, one cautious season at a time, that not every human hand reaching toward them was reaching to do harm. On the 2nd anniversary of the night Caleb first crawled through a tunnel and found a terrified girl pressed into the dark, they stood together at the mouth of that same tunnel. Now marked only by its small carved fox, its blankets and stones long since moved elsewhere, its purpose entirely changed. Mara rested her hand against the old wood of the barn wall, the way a person touches something sacred. "Do you ever think about it?" Caleb asked, echoing the question he'd asked her a year before. "What would have happened if I'd never gone looking that night?" This time, Mara didn't need to think before answering. "I think," she said, "the universe has a way of putting the right people beneath the right barns." She smiled, and took his hand, and together they walked back up toward the cabin, toward the lamplight already glowing warm in the windows, toward the home that had taken 2 lonely people and 1 small, terrified girl living in the dark and turned all of it, slowly and patiently, into something neither of them had ever quite dared to hope for. Somewhere below them, in the barn's quiet dark, the tunnel that had once been a hiding place sat empty and unafraid, not because the danger in the world had disappeared entirely, but because for the first time in a very long time, Mira Orendel had somewhere better to be. Upstairs. In the light. Waiting and waited for, in a home that was finally, truly, hers.